Kevin Marsh was 2 holes into his back nine when he stopped mid-swing, looked at me, and said, "Ray, you have to tell these guys what happened with Brandon." The 4 of us were out at Riverview Golf Club on a Saturday morning the way we'd been doing for the past 6 years. Former Army engineers who'd traded desert boots for golf cleats but still couldn't shake the habit of meeting up and talking shop. "Which version?" I asked, even though I already knew which one he meant. "The one where the founder's nephew tried to cut you out of your own work and ended up handing the whole company to you on a silver platter." Dave Whitaker, who'd served with me at Fort Bragg and now ran his own consulting practice out of Columbus, lowered his 9-iron and stared. "Oh, I'm hearing this. I'm Ray Caldwell, by the way, 51 years old. Spent 23 years in the Army Corps of Engineers before I transitioned out, and I've spent the 18 years since building industrial automation software at Meridian Process Technologies, a mid-sized company out of Dayton, Ohio that makes the systems that keep factory floors running from auto plants in Michigan to chemical refineries along the Gulf Coast. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing that ends up in Forbes, but the kind of work that matters because when our software fails, assembly lines stop and people get hurt." "All right," I said, tapping my ball marker against my palm, "but you guys need to understand something first. This story isn't really about Brandon Holt. It's about what happens when someone who's never built anything in their life decides they understand your work better than you do." The whole thing started on a Wednesday morning in March. I was in the middle of a live system integration test with 3 engineers from Kruger Industrial, a German manufacturing conglomerate that had been evaluating our platform for the better part of 14 months. These weren't junior procurement people. Hans Gruber was their VP of Global Operations. Ingrid Fischer ran their Technical Compliance Division. And Stefan Kolb was the senior engineer who actually understood what our software did at the hardware level. 3 people whose collective opinion would determine whether Meridian landed a $180 million contract to become Kruger's exclusive automation partner across 12 facilities in 5 countries. We were 90 minutes into a 4-hour demonstration when the conference room door opened without a knock. Brandon Holt walked in wearing the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been told no by someone whose opinion you respected. 27 years old, fresh off an MBA from Vanderbilt, and recently installed as Chief Strategy Officer by his uncle Gerald, who'd founded Meridian 17 years ago and still owned the majority stake. Brandon had been at the company for 8 months. In those 8 months, he'd reorganized 2 departments that didn't need reorganizing, introduced a productivity framework that nobody used, and scheduled more strategy sessions than I could count, where the only strategy ever discussed was how to make Brandon look indispensable. He stepped past our German guests without so much as a nod and leaned down to whisper in my ear, "Uncle Gerald needs you. Now." It wasn't a request. I looked at Hans Gruber, who had stopped talking mid-sentence. I looked at Ingrid Fischer, who had the expression of someone recalibrating their opinion of every American company all at once. I looked at Stefan Kolb, who just slowly closed his laptop. 23 years in the Army teaches you to read a room. I'd managed emergency shutdowns on compromised infrastructure in places I'm still not allowed to name. I knew the difference between a situation that could be recovered and one that had just turned. This was the second kind. "Gentlemen," I said, keeping my voice level the way they train you to do when everything around you is going sideways, "I sincerely apologize. Let me get us rescheduled for first thing tomorrow morning. I'll have our full technical team ready, and I'll personally walk you through everything we didn't get to cover today." They left professionally, the way people do when they're too experienced to make a scene but too smart not to notice what just happened. Hans Gruber shook my hand at the door and said nothing except, "Tomorrow, Mr. Caldwell. I'll be there." The way he said it made clear he wasn't sure I would be. Kevin had already abandoned any pretense of golf. He was leaning against his cart, arms crossed, grinning. Let me guess. Gerald's office was not a pleasant conversation. "Not for Gerald," I said. I'd walked down the hallway to the corner office and found Gerald Holt sitting behind his desk, looking like a man who understood exactly what his nephew had just done and had no idea what to do about it. Brandon stood off to one side with the posture of someone who thought he'd just made a power move. "Gerald," I said as I sat down, "do you want to tell me what was so urgent it couldn't wait 4 hours? Or do you want me to tell you what just happened in that conference room?" Gerald rubbed his face with both hands. He was 63 years old, former Navy, the kind of founder who'd actually built things before he managed them. He understood people. He understood work. What he'd never quite figured out was his sister's son, who'd shown up 8 months ago with a business degree and an assumption that understanding spreadsheets was the same as understanding a business. Brandon stepped forward. "I called that meeting because I've been reviewing the Kruger contract terms and I have concerns about the IP licensing structure. I think we're leaving significant revenue on the table." I looked at him for a moment. I think of you, I said quietly, or of Meridian. He blinked. What's that supposed to mean? It means the Kruger deal closes in 72 hours. It means we just walked out of a 4-hour integration demo with 3 senior decision makers who flew in from Frankfurt to be here. And it means whatever your concerns are about IP licensing, they could have waited until tomorrow afternoon. Gerald was quiet. Brandon was not. He had more to say. He always had more to say. And what followed was a 15-minute lecture about strategic leverage and monetization frameworks, and something about how companies like Meridian undersell themselves by not understanding their own value. I let him talk. I'd sat through artillery barrages in the Kuwaiti desert. I could sit through a 27-year-old's MBA pitch. When he finally finished, Gerald looked at me with the expression of a man who wanted to apologize but had convinced himself it wasn't necessary. Ray, I think Brandon raises some fair points. We can pick the Kruger demo back up tomorrow. I just need you to work with Brandon on the licensing terms before the close. I nodded. I said, fine. What I did not say was the thing I already knew, that whatever Brandon thought he was doing, the timer had already started. Dave whistled low. 72 hours. Exactly. 72 hours until my annual performance bonus was scheduled to process. And most people at Meridian didn't know what that bonus actually triggered. You have to understand something about Gerald Holt, I told the guys, taking a sip of water from my cart bottle. Gerald built Meridian from nothing. He'd had one failed company before this one, a hardware startup that got hollowed out when a venture capital firm took a controlling stake and replaced his entire technical leadership team with people who knew finance but didn't know engineering. He'd watched his life's work get disassembled by people who understood the balance sheet but not the product. When he started Meridian, he made himself a promise. The people who built the core technology would always have a stake in it, not just stock options or profit sharing, something structural. Something that couldn't be undone by a bad board vote or a nephew with an MBA. About 7 years ago, Gerald had pulled me aside after the company holiday party. We ended up in his office with a bottle of Blanton's and a conversation I didn't fully understand the weight of until much later. Ray, he'd said, I'm building something into your employment contract. Something my old lawyer is calling a founder's continuity clause. Your annual bonus, when it processes, doesn't just transfer money. It transfers co-ownership rights to the core PLC algorithm suite and all associated process patents. Kevin had gone completely still. The algorithm that runs every Meridian system? That's the one. Why would he do that? Dave asked. Same reason Admiral Cross did it for Marcus Reed, Kevin said quietly. Protection. Exactly right. Gerald had seen what happened to companies when the engineers who built the foundation got pushed out by people who wanted to monetize what they didn't understand. He'd lived it. So he wrote a clause that made me the safest person in the building. As long as I stayed employed, Meridian kept full operational control of their own technology. But if they ever could transferred permanently and irrevocably to me as individual proprietor. The clause had sat dormant for years. Every October, my bonus would process. The rights would briefly transfer to me, and then automatically revert when I showed up for work the next morning. Clean, invisible, unremarkable. Gerald called it his insurance policy. I'd spent most of those years thinking he was being overly cautious. Meridian was solid, growing. Gerald was reasonable. What I hadn't fully accounted for was Brandon. I got home that Wednesday evening and my phone started up before I'd even gotten my jacket off. First call was from our lead integration engineer, Carlos, who'd watched the whole conference room incident from the hallway window and wanted to know if the Kruger deal was dead. Not yet, I told him. Keep tomorrow's prep schedule exactly as planned. Second call was from Dave himself, who had a buddy in Meridian's sales team and had already heard 3 different versions of the story through the industry grapevine. Third call was from someone I didn't expect. Ray Caldwell? Speaking. This is Ingrid Fisher. I was surprised enough that I sat down at my kitchen table. Miss Fisher, I said, I want to again apologize for this afternoon. Her English was precise, careful, almost formal. I appreciate that, Mr. Caldwell. I'm calling because I wanted you to know something before tomorrow. Our board has approved the Meridian partnership. The technical evaluation is complete, but there is a condition in our acquisition agreement, a personnel clause, naming you specifically as essential to the technology transfer and the 5-year integration period. If you are not confirmed as part of the post-close technical leadership, we have the contractual right to withdraw. I pulled up the countdown timer I'd built years ago on my laptop, the same one I updated every October when bonus season came around. 70 hours, 11 minutes, and 44 seconds. That's interesting, Miss Fisher. Mr. Caldwell, I am going to ask you directly. Are you concerned about your position at Meridian? Let me just say, I told her carefully, that the next 70 hours are going to be eventful. There was a pause on the line. I see. Then I would suggest you make sure you are available tomorrow morning. We will be there at 8. I opened a bottle of Jefferson's, the one my son had given me for Father's Day, and sat with the quiet of it for a while. My son, Marcus, was a sophomore at Ohio State studying mechanical engineering. His tuition was substantial. My settlement from the divorce with Karen was on its final payment schedule. That $74,000 bonus wasn't abstract to me, it was the thing that kept the practical math of my life from becoming complicated. Brandon, he hadn't just tried to embarrass me in front of a client. He'd tried to mess with something real. Dave leaned against the golf cart with his arms crossed. And he had no idea about the clause. Not even a suspicion. I said it the same way I'd say anything obvious. He'd been at the company 8 months. He'd never read a contract in his life that wasn't summarized for him by someone else. Gerald knew about it, of course. But I don't think Gerald had imagined a scenario where it would matter, because Gerald had never imagined a scenario where Brandon would have this much operational authority. The next morning started with Kruger. Hans, Ingrid, and Stefan arrived at 8 sharp, and we spent 4 hours going through everything: the PLC architecture, the fail-safe redundancy protocols, the API structure, that would let Kruger's existing equipment communicate with our system without a full hardware overhaul. Stefan Kolb had actual questions. Good ones. The kind that told me he'd been working with automation systems long enough to understand what made ours different and why the difference mattered. We finished at noon and Hans Gruber shook my hand with both of his and said, "Mr. Caldwell, we will see you at closing on Friday, 46 hours and 20 minutes away." I was back at my desk when the call from HR came. Brandon had been in Gerald's office all morning. The meeting request that appeared on my calendar at 12:30 said simply, "Organizational review." When I walked in, Gerald looked like a man who had been talked into something he wasn't entirely sure about. Brandon stood to one side with the specific posture of someone performing authority. "Ray," Gerald said, not quite meeting my eyes, "we're making some structural changes to the technical leadership team as we move into the Kruger integration phase. Brandon has some ideas about streamlining the org chart." Brandon slid a folder across the desk. I opened it, my termination letter. Effective immediately. Dated exactly 72 hours before my bonus was scheduled to process and 38 hours before the Kruger deal was set to close. I read it carefully. Picked up the pen from Gerald's desk. Signed it without a word. Brandon had been expecting something: anger, negotiation, desperation. He'd mentally rehearsed the version where I argued, where I raised my voice, where I made it about ego. Instead, I set the pen down, buttoned my jacket, and stood up. "Good luck with the Kruger close," I said to Gerald. Brandon called after me as I reached the door. "That's it? No speech?" I turned around and looked at him the way you look at someone who has just made an irreversible decision without understanding what they've decided. "I hope you've read the full acquisition agreement," I said. He smiled like I'd just conceded. I walked out. Kevin was shaking his head slowly with the expression of someone who's just watched a chess match where one player thinks it's checkers. He had no idea. "None at all," I said. The walk to the parking lot was the last time I'd be escorted out of a building I'd spent 17 years building systems inside of. The HR coordinator who walked me out was 24 years old and had been with the company 11 months. She looked uncomfortable. I told her she'd done her job fine and that whatever happened next wasn't her fault. She looked like she wanted to say something but didn't know what. By the time I'd pulled out of the parking garage, my phone had already started. Carlos texted first, "What just happened?" Then Dave. Then 2 former colleagues who'd apparently heard from someone who'd heard from someone. The defense contractor world is tight. Well, so is industrial automation software in the Midwest. When someone with 17 years of core development work suddenly goes available, it travels through the network faster than the official announcement. I sent the same message back to all of them. "Still here. Give it 72 hours." I spent that afternoon doing something that had nothing to do with Meridian. I drove over to Dayton National Cemetery and walked down to Gerald Sr., section Gerald's father, who'd served in Vietnam, and whose funeral Gerald had asked me to attend 6 years ago because he said his father had always respected engineers. I don't know exactly why I went there. Something about wanting to stand somewhere quiet and remind myself what actually mattered. "The work matters," I said out loud, to nobody in particular. Not the org chart. The work. That evening, Ingrid Fisher called again. Her voice was more controlled this time, but the edges were tight in a way that told me her legal team had been busy. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm listening. Our counsel has just confirmed your employment status. I need to ask you something very directly. Is there anything in your contractual arrangement with Meridian that we should know about before Friday's close? I watched the timer count down on my laptop. 53 hours, 8 minutes. Let me put it this way, I said. The conversation we're about to have is going to be a lot more interesting in about 53 hours. That pause again, Ingrid Fisher, letting silence do work. Mr. Caldwell, we need to understand the risk exposure before we commit to Friday. I understand that, but some things have to play out in the right sequence. Trust the timeline. The next morning, Meridian stock had opened down 11% on analyst speculation about the Kruger deal. A trade publication had picked up the personnel change story and was asking whether the departure of the company's lead systems architect 48 hours before a major acquisition close represented a material risk to the deal. Gerald was on television by 9 a.m. saying the transition was planned and orderly. He didn't look like a man describing something planned and orderly. Brandon called at 10. I was on my second cup of coffee, and a 5-mile run had already cleared most of the noise from my head. His voice had lost the easy confidence from 2 days before. Ray, I need to talk to you. I'm listening, Brandon. I think maybe we moved too fast on the restructuring. There are some questions coming in from Kruger's side about the technology transfer, and they keep asking specifically about you. I set my coffee down. What kind of questions? About the algorithm suite. About who actually holds the development rights. About whether there's anything in your contract that he stopped himself. About whether there's what, Brandon? He was quiet for a moment. Did Gerald tell you about the continuity clause? Gerald and I talked about a lot of things over 17 years. Look, he said, his voice going from confident to careful to something closer to unsettled. Can we have a conversation about this? Maybe look at reinstatement, compensation, something that works for everyone? I'm not coming back to Meridian. What? Brandon, some things don't go backward. I said it without heat, without drama, just the plain version of it. I built that algorithm for 17 years. I was going to keep building it regardless of what title was on my business card. But I'm not going to spend the next 5 years watching you restructure things that don't need restructuring. I hung up and called my son. Hey, Dad. Marcus's voice had the background noise of a university library in it. You okay? I'm better than okay. I told him a version of the story abbreviated, the parts he could use. He listened without interrupting, which told me he already understood it was serious. He'd grown up watching me deploy twice and come back to civilian life and start over and build something. He understood that his father did not make dramatic gestures. So when I told him calmly that the next 24 hours were going to change things, he believed me. Dad, he said after a moment, did they really think they could fire you and the deal would still work? They thought the deal was about the company, I said. The deal was always about the work. And the work doesn't transfer without the person who built it. He was quiet for a second. Your tuition is fine, by the way. Dad, I know. I just wanted you to know it was never in question for me. He laughed a little. You sound like Grandpa right now. Good, I said. Your grandfather was usually right. Kevin had pulled out his phone and was taking notes. I told him he didn't need to because this part wasn't complicated. At 4:32 the following afternoon, my laptop chimed with the notification I'd been watching for 2 days. Automated system, same one I'd built and maintained for 7 years, same one that ran every October. Transfer complete. All development rights, patents, and co-ownership interests in the Meridian Process Core algorithm suite and associated automation protocols now vested in Raymond L. Caldwell, individual proprietor. 41 pages of legal documentation and one clean, quiet computer notification. My phone rang while I was still reading the confirmation. It was Ingrid Fisher, and I could hear the specific quality of stillness in her voice that happens when someone who is very good at controlling situations realizes the situation has changed without their input. Mr. Caldwell, our legal team has just been notified of a patent and IP registration update. We understand that development rights for the Meridian Core algorithm suite have transferred to you personally. That's correct. There was a pause. This changes the nature of Friday's close considerably. I would imagine it does. Mr. Caldwell, I want you to understand something. Kruger has invested 14 months and significant resources in this evaluation. We believe in the technology. We believe in the platform you've built. But we cannot close a $180 million acquisition on technology that isn't owned by the company we're acquiring. No, I agreed. You'd have to deal directly with the person who does own it. She was quiet for longer this time. The good kind of quiet, the kind where someone is doing real thinking rather than managing conversation. Mr. Caldwell, are you open to exploring a direct licensing and partnership structure with Kruger? I picked up my good bourbon again, the Jeffersons. I think we should have that conversation, I said. I think it's going to go well. Dave had been quiet through the whole middle section of the story, and now he said simply, "How bad was the fallout at Meridian?" "I'll tell you how bad. Gerald called me from his car that evening, parked outside my apartment complex, same as Marcus Reed's Richard Pemberton, which made me feel like I was living inside a pattern I'd read somewhere. He looked like he'd aged 8 years in 48 hours. I got in because Gerald had always been straight with me, and because the people who build companies deserve to be heard even when things have gone wrong. My nephew made a mistake," he said. "I know. Gerald, your nephew made a decision that was 3 moves deep in a game he didn't know he was playing." The silence stretched. "I want you to know I didn't authorize it. He reached out to HR on his own. I found out after the fact. I believe you. What I also believe is that it happened because he had the authority to make that call, and that's on you." He didn't argue with that. Gerald was honest enough not to. "Marcus." He said he always called me Marcus when he was being serious. "I have 412 people on payroll. Engineers, technicians, operations staff, people with kids and mortgages and careers built around Meridian. Some of them have been there almost as long as you." I studied his face. The weight of it was real. Gerald had spent 17 years building something that mattered, and now he was watching it unravel because he'd handed operational authority to someone who didn't understand what they were operating. "What are you asking me to do, Gerald?" "I'm asking you to consider what a fair resolution looks like. For you, for the company, for the people who didn't make this mistake." I checked the time. 18 hours until I was scheduled to sit down with Kruger's acquisition team. "Gerald, here's what I can tell you. The technology is going to keep doing what it was built to do. The work isn't going anywhere. But the way it gets deployed going forward has changed, and I'd suggest you talk to your lawyers tonight about what options still exist, because by tomorrow afternoon, this looks different." He asked what I meant. I told him to read Section 8 of my original employment agreement, the provision Gerald's old contract attorney had written in 2017 and that Brandon had never once looked at. Gerald's face went pale the way faces do when someone who is very good at business realizes they've missed something foundational. "Ray, what's in Section 8? The reason your nephew should have fired me in January, not March." I got out of the car and let him make the calls he needed to make. The next morning, Friday, I was at Kruger's temporary offices downtown at 8 sharp in a different suit than I'd worn to any Meridian meeting in years. Ingrid Fisher, Hans Gruber, Stefan Kolb, and 3 people from their legal team were already there. We spent 6 hours negotiating a direct IP licensing and technical partnership agreement that made the original $180 million acquisition structure look like a preliminary sketch. Kruger got what they actually needed: the algorithm, the continued development work, the integration expertise without the overhead of acquiring a company whose valuation had just become complicated. I got an exclusive licensing guarantee, equity participation in the Kruger automation division, and complete technical authority over the platform I'd spent 17 years building. Stefan Kolb shook my hand at the end of the session and said, in very careful English, "Mr. Caldwell, the work you've done is genuinely excellent." I told him to call me Ray. The news broke Saturday morning. The headline read, "Kruger Industrial pivots to direct IP licensing. As Meridian acquisition collapses, developer holds core patents." It was trending across every trade publication by noon. Meridian's stock opened down 37%. Trading was halted twice. Gerald Holt issued a statement that read like a man dictating his own professional obituary. He publicly acknowledged that a personnel decision made without board review had triggered the IP transfer clause, that Brandon Holt had been removed from all operational roles effective immediately, and that Marcus, that I had served the company with distinction and deserved significantly better treatment than I had received. Brandon was not present at the statement. I heard through the network that he'd been escorted from the building Thursday evening, company access cards deactivated, corporate card frozen, an MBA and a title, and 8 months of strategy frameworks. And in the end, he'd handed me the keys to 50 years of combined patent value, because he'd never once read the contract of the person he decided to remove. Dave was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What happened to him?" "Same thing that happens to all of them," Kevin said, answering for me. "They land somewhere that doesn't know what they did." I nodded. "Last I heard he was in Nashville doing something with commercial real estate." "Which is fine. Commercial real estate is a perfectly legitimate business, and I genuinely hope he does well at it. But you don't rebuild what you took apart at Meridian by doing something different somewhere else. Some lessons only land when the consequences are specific." My son Marcus called when the news broke Saturday morning, and his first words were, "Dad, I just saw the story. Are you actually okay?" "I'm better than okay," I told him. Dad, your name is literally in every trade publication right now. I know. You don't sound like a person whose name is in every trade publication right now. That's because I've been awake since 4, and I'm on my 3rd cup of coffee, and I'm looking at a partnership agreement that's going to fund 3 generations of this family if we execute it right. He laughed. And my tuition? I told you it was never in question. He was quiet for a second. Dad, I want to say something. You ready? Always, kid. You always told me that the people who try to make you small are usually just afraid of what you built. I didn't really understand what that meant until now. I sat with that for a moment. Your grandfather said the same thing to me in 1994, and I didn't understand it either until about 2019. Some things take time to land. The conversation that meant the most came 2 weeks later. Hans Gruber knocked on the door of my new office, not at Meridian, but at the Kruger Regional Hub in Cincinnati, a space they'd set up specifically for the North American integration work, and asked if I had a few minutes. He sat down across from me and said, without preamble, the 412 Meridian employees, I have a proposal. Kruger needed people who understood the technology at the implementation level, not management restructuring, not framework consultants, engineers, and technicians who knew how the systems actually worked. We offered positions to 231 of them within 6 weeks. Not all 412, but the engineers, the ones Brandon's reorganization had made miserable. They didn't hesitate. Carlos was the first one through the door. He brought 11 people with him on his first day. Gerald retired to his house on Lake Erie 2 months after the story broke. I bear him no ill will. Gerald built something real and spent 17 years running it with integrity, and the mistake he made was not the restructuring, it was trusting someone who hadn't earned it with authority over people who had. That's a human mistake. It's a common one. And the consequences were his to carry, not mine to amplify. Kevin raised his water bottle in a toast when I finally stopped talking. To reading your contracts, he said. To reading your contracts, Dave agreed. And to the guys who wrote the clauses, I added. We drank to that. I told them what I tell every young engineer who asks me for advice now, which is the same thing Gerald Holt told me in his office in 2017, with a glass of bourbon and 17 years of hard-won perspective behind it. Build something that can't be separated from the person who built it. Not because you're protecting yourself from bad people, though you are, but because the work that matters is always personal. It belongs to the hands that shaped it. Contracts don't create that. They just make sure everyone else knows it too. The $74,000 bonus processed exactly on schedule. Contract law doesn't negotiate with office politics, but that was just the mechanism. The actual payoff was watching Stefan Kolb demo the 3rd-generation version of our algorithm to a room full of German automotive engineers 6 months later and hearing him say, without any particular fanfare, this system was built by Ray Caldwell. He'll be presenting next. I walked to the front of that room in Cincinnati, Ohio, in front of people who'd flown in from 4 countries to understand what I'd spent 17 years building, and I thought about Gerald's office, and Brandon's smirk, and the parking lot escort, and Ingrid Fisher's 2-second pause on the phone, and none of it felt like revenge. It felt like arithmetic, like something that had been calculated correctly all along, just waiting for the right variable to resolve. Brandon thought he was optimizing a business. Turns out he was just moving line items while I was working on something that didn't fit in a spreadsheet. That's the part that never changes. The people who try to cut the corners of what you've built don't understand that the corners are load-bearing. Brandon learned that. Gerald knew it. And every engineer at that Cincinnati demo who'd come over from Meridian knew it the morning they walked out of a restructured org chart and into work that meant something. We raised our glasses to Gerald Holt Sr., to the value of a well-written contract, and to the particular satisfaction of being exactly who you are when someone bets that you're not. The timer on my laptop counts up now, not down. Every morning when I sit down at my desk and open the platform that has my name in the foundational documentation, it counts up from the moment things changed. Patience beats panic. Preparation beats politics. And sometimes the person who tries to shrink your career ends up funding everything that comes after it. Brandon Holt learned that the hard way. I hope, wherever he is, the lesson was worth the price of it.